Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Danny Chapman. I'm an animation engineer here at Epic, and I have a particular interest in character physics. And today, we're going to be joined by my mech friend, who's been busy doing his warm-up exercises, and we're going to tell you all about using physics in Control Rig. So, as we prepared this presentation, the mech and I had a little chat about who might be here in the audience today, and what you might want to do with Unreal Engine. So the mech thought that maybe lots of you will be animators or riggers making linear content like this, perhaps for movies or cinematics. And if so, you would want to animate realistic, organic, and physical characters like this dragon. And then you'd probably be working in a DCC tool like Maya or Houdini or something similar, and maybe using a plugin or a system that helps you with the physics and secondary motion, because you want to concentrate on telling your story, and you don't want to be sweating over the detailed movement of every part of this creature. But I told the mech that actually there'll be lots of game developers here too. So game developers want to make realistic, organic, and physical characters like this dragon for their interactive game. And since you're all here, you're probably using Unreal Engine, and probably, up until now, using physics through blueprints or the animation system. And you want to get nice interactions and secondary motion, and reduce the need to have animations for absolutely everything. But then we both exclaimed, why should you have to work in two different packages, learn two different tools and techniques just to do really what's the same thing? So wouldn't it be great to be able to rig up your dragon, animate and interact with it using physics, and seamlessly share assets and techniques between game and cinematic sequences? Okay, but can't you already do that in Unreal Engine? Well, of course, we have character physics in Unreal Engine. So you can check out the content examples project here, and you'll see all sorts of setups with physics running on characters. And some of these are using the physics control component. So they're running in the global solver, running with blueprint, and helping you apply physical controls to your characters. Some of them use the rigid body with control animation graph node, and these will be running little local simulations, but essentially providing you with the same control methods. And you can certainly do really powerful things with these, but there are limitations. So if you've got a complex physics setup, the logic for this often ends up being spread out between multiple assets. You have to edit in things in different places, and it can be really difficult to create the setup and also to work with it too. And this all becomes even harder if you want to take that same character and animate it with physics in Unreal Engine. So could Control Rig help? Well, one of the nice things about Control Rig is that it allows you to present really simple, intuitive interfaces to the user. And this also makes it really effective and fun to work with. Even though internally, there might be some really complex implementation that the user really shouldn't have to worry about. And this user, which of course might be yourself, they might be an animator or a game designer using blueprints or a programmer or some other system like your game's AI. And then in addition, by having a well-defined interface mechanism, control rigs work alongside lots of other tools in Unreal Engine. So today, the mech and I are going to show you how you can start with a standard control rig that you might have used before, like this one. And then we're going to add 4 types of component to it. A physics solver, which acts like a little world. Physics bodies to add movement and collision. Physics joints to hold everything together. And physics controls to let you make it do what you want it to do. And we're going to show that by using these physics components in your control rig, then your physical control rig is going to work alongside lots of other Unreal Engine tools as well. Okay, so this is the plan. So I'm going to start by showing you these physics building blocks, what they're for, how they work together. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can animate in Engine with physics. And then we'll look at how control rig physics was used in-game for the Witcher 4 Unreal Engine 5 tech demo. And then I've got a few tips before we finish. But before we get into the details, actually, if you just want to get into Unreal Engine, try out control rig physics, get up and running quickly, I thoroughly recommend this excellent tutorial on YouTube by Stefan, who's here. And today, I'm not going to try to match that in terms of presenting a tutorial. Instead, I want to show you the physics building blocks, explain how they work in the context of a real character, and then maybe spark some ideas for how you could use physics in your own characters. And I'll also have to assume a basic knowledge of control rig, so either you've used it before, or at least seen it in action, maybe in Helge's or Stefan's talks, or it's been running on the Unreal Engine booths outside. Okay, so if you do want to try some of these things out and you don't have any control rigs at the moment to start with, there are some samples on Fab, and that's where the mech came from. And once you've got it into your project, all you need to do is enable the physics control plugin. And then in Unreal Engine 5.7, there's also the control rig physics plugin as well. Okay, so here's that mech running inside the control rig editor. I mean, it has no physics yet, but it does have IK-based controls for posing. And these are great, but the actual movement is not inherently physical. There's no dynamics there. And there are a few jiggly bits on the feet and on the antenna. But if you wanted to animate this mech by hand, you'd need to spend a lot of time making it look like it's got weight and inertia. You'd have to adjust poses so they don't clip through the environment and so on. So let's start by adding some physics to it. So the first thing we need is a physics solver. So this is going to act like a little world. It's going to keep track of what objects exist and how they're moving. And we're going to have to update this world to keep it in sync with the rest of the game or system. So we can add it in the control rig graph like this during construction. And you can attach it to any bone, but it's often best to put it at the root of the bones in the hierarchy. Or alternatively, you can add it manually. So you can right-click in the hierarchy on the bottom left, select a bone, and then add rig physics solver component. And either way, it's pretty much the same. We end up with the physics solver as a component in the hierarchy. So you can see it here underneath the root bone. At least people at the front can see it. And components are new in Unreal Engine 5.6. And they just allow us to store data underneath bones or other elements in the rig. So when we select it, there are lots of settings over on that side. Now, these are settings on the solver. Hopefully there's help text for everything, but actually the defaults generally work okay, at least to get things started. But just making the physics solver isn't enough. We need to update it during the forward solve event to keep it in sync with the rest of the system. So we can do that by calling step physics solver in the control rig graph. And since it's going to be you, as you make the control rig, who adds this to the control rig graph, you can decide exactly where it should go. So here, I've chosen to place it after the main solve, and that's the one that's going to be generated the IK poses that we saw earlier. And we place it before this little jiggle solve. So those wobbling cables and the antenna are actually going to respond to the physics that we're going to be adding in a moment. So in fact, you can have multiple solvers in your control rig, and you can decide in which order they get stepped, or they can have different settings, and you can decide, for example, you might want to skip them. And this can be really useful for more complex rigs. But back to our mech. I mean, you haven't seen anything moving yet, and that means it's not really fun. So let's add a physics body to give it some movement and collision. So we're going to start simple, and we're just going to add one physics body at the base bone. That's like the pelvis of this creature. So just like before, we can spawn a physics body during construction. And here we indicate it's going to be owned by the base bone, because that's the bone we want it to affect. Or like before, we can add it manually like this by right-clicking the hierarchy on the base bone and then selecting Add Rig Physics Body Component. And either way, the result is the same. So we have a physics body component in the hierarchy, just underneath the physics solver component. On the right-hand side, we can see it's got lots of properties, and that includes things like an automatically created collision shape. And hopefully you can just about see it. There's a thin yellow box on the left-hand side. And it has properties like, for example, its movement type. So you can make it simulated, where it's going to fall under gravity and have inertia. Or you can make it kinematic. And if it's kinematic, it's just going to track the target animation, but provide collision. And it also has options like this use automatic solver. So when this is ticked, then the system's going to automatically add this body to the solver above it in the hierarchy. Okay, so we're going to connect up that step physics solver node and see what happens. So I just drag across. And hey, oh, that's not so good. It's disappeared. So the mech isn't too happy about falling away to infinity. But we can add a ground really easily. So we can select the physics solver node and the component, and we can add a shape to it. And so as I'm talking, I'm just setting the size of the shape and the position. And now that box at the pelvis of the mech is just going to lie down and rest on the floor. Don't worry about its legs yet. Alternatively, actually in Unreal Engine 5.7, there's now an option in the solver to automatically import world objects so you can collide against world objects. So that makes it even easier. Okay, so the mech is a rather impatient little creature. And he says, why can't we just fast forward to the end and add physics bodies to all the bones in the rig? Okay, who am I to argue with the mech? So if we want to try this, we can just loop over all the bones during construction and spawn a physics body for each one, just like this. So let's see what happens when we step it. Okay. Okay, so the mech is still not happy. It's rather undignified, so we're going to have to fix a few things. So here we are in slow motion, and let's look at the problems. So the first problem is there are too many bodies, especially tiny ones. So we're creating bodies for every bone, even the little tiny ones that we wouldn't want to simulate. The second thing is there's nothing holding the bodies together. And the third is that some of those automatically generated collision shapes are just not good enough. Now, they're much too big, they stick out in the wrong directions, so they're producing unwanted overlaps and collisions. Okay, so let's fix those problems. So problem number one, too many bodies. Well, that's easy. So instead of looping over all the bones during construction, we just gather up the ones we're interested in. And so here we have a simple bit of control rig graph, and it's going to store the relevant bones in this array called physics bones. And then the second problem is that there's nothing holding the bodies together. So that brings us to the second physics component, the physics joint. So we can make one of these for each element of the physics bones array as they're constructed. We can skip the base bone since it's at the root of the skeleton and it doesn't have a parent. And by default, the physics joint is going to pin a body to its parent in the hierarchy. So just like regular bones are connected together by joints in our own bodies. And it will also disable collision between each body and its parent. So that should help with those unwanted collisions too. Okay, so let's see how that improves things in slow motion again. Okay, well, it's kind of doing better. It's less like some exploding supernova and more like a jellyfish. Okay, so but remember, we still have a third problem to solve. Those poor collision shapes, which you can see here, and producing unwanted overlaps. So in the construction graph, we can just make a few small tweaks to some of the physics bodies. So I'm not going to show the details, but we can just do things like in here, we just resize the main cannon and one of the other body parts, so they're not just stupidly big. We can adjust some of the other shapes created because actually some of them are too small and they don't work very well with physics. And we can disable some collision for some internal bones along the legs. So it's really not very complex. But I know you want to see the result. Whoops, sorry. Let's make a small diversion to take a closer look at what these innocent-looking functions are actually doing. So here, as an example, we have this node. It's going to change friction on some of the body parts. So when it runs, these new values that I'm giving it don't actually get written directly into the simulation. Instead, they get written into the hierarchy, into the component in the hierarchy. And it's only during the next step physics solver call that they make it from there into the simulation. So this is actually great, as it means all the information about what's going on is sitting there in the hierarchy. You can click on it, inspect it, and so on. And in principle, anyway, you can change it. And it also means we don't need to worry too much about the cost of poking new data, new values into the simulation as it runs, because they're all just going to get, all the changes are just going to get batched up and applied in one call into the simulation. Okay, so let's get back to our mech and see if those collision fixes have made him a little bit happier. So hooray, we have a working ragdoll. So now it's behaving sensibly, we can look more closely at those physics joints that we added. Okay, so the physics joints have got two main capabilities. So the first is to limit the range of motion between the bodies they connect. So by default, they pin points on the two bodies together, and that's what's stopping the ragdoll from falling apart. but they can also limit the angular range of motion too. So on the right-hand side, you can see that when I create these physics joints, I'm just going to limit the maximum twist and swing in each joint to 20 degrees. And over on the left-hand side in the viewport, you can see some visualization which shows these green and red cones, and that just shows us that limited range of motion. So this is it running, and actually, if you just want a completely floppy ragdoll, this is even better, because it's stopping the bones from twisting around unrealistically. Now, the other thing the physics joint contains is a motor drive, and these motor drives act a little bit like muscles. So now, instead of setting the limits, when we spawn the physics joint, we're going to enable the twist and swing drives. And we're going to give them some quite large values for the stiffness and damping, so they have a bit of strength. So now, when we set it running, you can see the joint drives are letting the mech stand up and support its own weight. And actually, they drive each individual joint to the target angles coming from whatever pose has been calculated at the point we step physics. So that means we can use those animation controls to animate a target pose, and we see physics driving towards that pose, and we get the inertia and collision. And the mech says this is kind of quite fun too. So we've made this with just a handful of control rig graph nodes based around 3 components: the physics solver, the physics body, and the physics joint. And you've just seen that the physics joint gives you control over the creature. So you might ask yourself, isn't that just enough? Isn't that enough to do everything we would want? Okay, so as I said, the drives in the physics joint, they behave a little bit like muscles or motors. So they essentially match what you'd have in a real creature or robot. So you could say, if we're simulating reality, isn't that going to result in realistic motion? But the problem is that unless we got some really complex system to control them, it's going to be you who has to figure out how to activate and drive these muscles. Somehow you need to act like the brain of the creature, and that's an impossible task. So in reality, you want to give the impression of that. You want to be able to pick and choose exactly how the animation and the simulation work together. So I like to think of it more like controlling a puppet, where you get to see the physics you want without the kind of wobble and the slip and the sliding that you don't. So the fourth building block is a physics control. So we're going to add some of these to the mech and see how they work. So now, during construction, so along with the bodies and stuff, for each body, we're going to spawn a physics control component. And we're going to make it control, with this option here, we're going to make it control each body relative to its parent in the hierarchy. So for example, the lower arm is going to be controlled relative to the upper arm. We're going to give it some angular strength. It's going to appear in the hierarchy. And then when we step the solver, it's going to appear in the simulation. So now these controls actually behave really the same as the drives we saw just a moment ago, just like the muscles in a character. So we can change the strength. So I'm just going to gradually increase it here until the mech is able to stand up. The values for the strength are actually a lot smaller and easier to work with than the ones in the drive. That's good. And just like with the joint drives, it's going to drive towards the incoming pose of each bone relative to its parent. And as we change the shape of that target pose with the IK controls, the mech is going to track it physically with inertia and collision. So when these controls are set up to drive a body relative to its parent, we're going to call them parent space controls. And they behave a bit like muscles in a creature. But now we're going to reconfigure that same control so that it no longer operates relative to the parent body. So we disable this checkbox, and instead each control is going to drive each body independently to where the target is in world or simulation space. And we can adjust separately the linear and angular strength of that control. And let's have a look and see how they behave. So we start with 0 strength on the controls, and then just increase the angular and then the linear strength. And already you can see the mech is a lot less wobbly than before, but it's still physical, it's still being simulated. And this is because each body is getting independently pulled by the controls into the position and orientation coming from the target pose. So it makes the mech move more like a puppet. But actually that's a really good thing when you want to direct its motion. And we can change the damping to make it more or less bouncy, as you can see here. And we can also change the strength. So when we make it weaker, it's going to move slower, and it's going to be more affected by gravity, and so on. So since these controls are working in the space of the whole simulation, I'm going to call them simulation space controls. And it turns out this pattern of making a physics body, a physics joint, a parent space control, and a simulation space control is so useful and kind of common, we made a single helper function to help you create them. We can call spawn physics components. And this, in one call, spawns the 4 components. It lets us set up most of the behavior properties in a single place. And it's also an example of one of the many helper functions which are going to make it easier to create these physics setups in your rig. And it really simplifies the control rig graphs. But of course, you still have access to the lowest level functions when you really need them. OK, so I think we made something which is starting to be kind of quite powerful. It's got quite a lot of physics going on it. It's starting to get a little bit complex internally. Not too bad yet. But is it simple to use? Well, no, because we can't expect users to go around poking in the internal control rig graph every time they want to enable a control or adjust a strength value. So we need to expose just what's needed to let animators and other users work with it. So that leads us to the final step, exposing these physics controls and properties to the user. Well, fortunately, we're using control rig, so it's kind of pretty simple. We can simply expose those physics settings as animation channels on either new or existing control rig controls. So, for example, if I select the base control, which is normally used to move the whole character around, I added some animation channels to it. And one of these is the simulation space linear strength. Then, during the forward solve, I can simply pick up that value, and I can use it to set the linear strength on all the physics, all the relevant physics controls. And so by doing this kind of thing, this lets you configure exactly how the user interacts with the rig. So as a very, very simple example, if your animator didn't like having to use a strength value of 30 to make the mech stand up, you could simply insert a multiplier into this bit of the graph so that now 1 means normal standing strength, and internally it multiplies it by 30. And of course, you can do much more complex things than that too. And there are lots and lots of functions that let you adjust almost any aspect of the behavior as it runs. So for example, you can change the movement mode of a body. So whether or not it's simulated with inertia and so on, versus being kinematic and simply tracking the target animation. You can adjust how much gravity is applied to a body, and so on. And each one of those nodes is just going to write the new values into the components in the hierarchy. It's going to get picked up and then passed into the simulation. OK, so let's see this working on our mech with physics integrated into the existing manipulator controls. So we've added some animation channels to the root control, and these are going to apply to the whole character. So there's a mode. 0 was kinematic. That's how it was at the start. Now it's 1, which means simulated everywhere. And I'm going to increase the simulation space strengths. And then we can animate the character, and we can see this puppet-like controlled motion. But we can also disable those sim space controls by setting their strength to 0, and we can increase now the parent space control strengths. And we can also control the character. So here we're going to just ramp them up again and make the character stand up. And we can see motion, which is kind of realistic. I know there's danger this mech can now fall over, but it's a little bit more wobbly and so on. And actually, when we select that foot control, you'll see there are also animation channels on the right-hand side. So I've set this up so these are overrides on the limb. So if I select the front right foot control, I can override the behavior on the front right leg. So then I can set the mode on that leg to 0, which means the whole leg is kinematic. Or I can set the mode to 1, which means the whole leg is simulated. Or I can set the mode to 2, which is going to make just the foot kinematic and the rest of the leg is simulated. And of course, we can also override things like the strength on the leg and things like that, and the gravity multiplier and so on. So with this setup, we can get almost complete control over the physics behavior of the character with just a minimal set of manipulators. And also remember, the setup here is just one example. It's just what I chose to make. So when rigging your own character, you can decide exactly how much detail to expose to the user through the controls, depending on what's actually required. It's also hard to stop playing it once you start. OK, so let's see what happens if we put this mech into a level. So we drag the mech into a level. Immediately, we see sequencer open up. And we see the regular controls. We can manipulate it. But also on the right-hand side, we've got these physics attributes. So we move forward to a frame here. We change mode to 1, which is going to make it simulate, set a key. Then we go back to the beginning, set the mode to 0, which is kinematic. And now when we play, we go from kinematic to ragdoll. OK, so that's the kind of hello world of animating with physics. And we're going to take a deeper look at animating in engine with physics in a minute. But first, let's recap and see why this way of doing things with physics and control rig is so powerful. So remember, we started with a regular control rig. We added a solver to represent a world and kind of manage everything. Physics bodies for collision and movement. Physics joints to keep everything together. Now, at this point, we can make a floppy ragdoll or a kind of floppy puppet. And then we add in the physics controls in their parent space and simulation space flavors. And these let us choose how we want bodies to move and respond to the animation input. And all the data for these is stored in the hierarchy. So they're just components underneath bones. So you can access and update them in the way that you normally would. So as we kind of zoom out of this view a little bit and look from the point of view of a control rig, we can use all the abilities of control rig to work on the hierarchy. So we can create things from the control rig graph, or we can create them manually, or we can use functions to create them from assets. We can change many, and eventually all, of these properties as the control rig updates. And we can expose nice interfaces through the control rig controls. And then as we zoom out further, view it from the point of view of the engine, then control rig itself integrates nicely with the other parts of the engine. So it works with modular rigging, animating in engine, cinematics, and then in-game with animation blueprints and the new Unreal animation framework. And since physics is working with control rig, then physics is going to work with all of these other systems too. So for example, you can make rig modules containing physics. And I think that was being shown in the Unreal 5.7 booth outside. And later on, we'll see how you can use pose library with physics settings, and so on for all the other standard animation and in-game systems. OK, so can you really animate with this? So I'm not an animator, but I thought I should actually try it myself. So it's one thing to just play around with physics and have fun with that, but it's another to achieve a particular goal. So I set myself a task. I wanted to make the mech look at the camera and then make it do a backflip, but it's not very good. It only gets halfway through, and then it's going to give up. So I made an animation which sketches out the motion I want to see. And there's the word sketch is doing quite a lot of work here. And this is going to be used to guide the physics. And in a moment, we'll see how the physics controls let us determine how that guiding should happen. So here we have the mech in the sequencer. The timeline covers 3 phases: the look, the jump, and the relax. And I just needed to key a handful of controls. So here on the bottom right, we have the physics properties on the root control at the beginning of the sequence. So remember, these ones are going to affect the whole character. So whilst he's going to look at the camera, we make the mech simulate, we disable gravity, and we use simulation space controls to track the target animation. We can also select the leg controls. On here, we override the settings. And here, we're going to make just the feet kinematic by using the mode equals 2. And this is all so that we can softly track the target animation whilst the mech turns to look at the camera without the feet slipping. Then in the next phase, during the jump, we adjust these controls by adding keys. So we re-enable gravity, we disable the linear sim space controls. So now gravity is going to determine the trajectory as it flies through the air. We keep the angular sim space controls, and this is going to make sure our mech rotates exactly half a turn during the jump. And on the legs, we disable the override. So the legs are just going to go back to doing what everything else on the mech is doing. So this is all to make the mech fly through the air. It's going to follow a natural trajectory, but the angular control guarantees he's going to land on his back without it looking like there's too much cheating going on. Then in the final section, we just want the mech to relax. So we're just going to ramp down the overall strength. And this is the result. And remember, we started from a really simple blocking animation, and we only keyed, literally a handful of properties. But actually, to me, what's more interesting is seeing it being used by a real animator, like Frederick Nilsson, who's a technical product management director at Epic. So Fred has been using control rig physics for quite a while now, and he really keeps on surprising me by showing me what he can do with it and how it works with the other animation tools. Often when I haven't even considered him using it with them. So he's not here, but he sent me this video of him giving a little demonstration of that. So I'm going to play that.
All right. Thanks, Danny. So I want to show how animators can already take advantage of some of this physics to kind of enhance their workflows and also take advantage of some of the Animate Engine toolset that we put in and use it as part of the process. So I have this animation here. Let me just play this. You'll see it's just a character kind of moving around and doing its thing. I'm going to turn on the control rigs. So this is a control rig that Danny gave me. It's just the mannequin, and he added a whole bunch of his very cool physics stuff. So these are just settings, and they're just values. So I'm going to just turn on physics now, and now I'll play that same animation again. Now you see I get a nice little bounce and overlap on the arms. So, already you can use that to get free overlap, which is pretty cool. And I can tweak all these settings. I can even turn on the physics bodies if I want to kind of see them, how they're going to collide and what's enabled, not. So, all right, so I'll do that. I'll turn those back off. And you'll notice this is a live simulation. So, just as Danny's showing, as I'm posing and manipulating, it is colliding and bouncing around. So what I found is since they really are just values on, these controls, I could use the pose library to store some different poses of physics settings. So I have a few here that I've set up. I'm just going to apply this guy. So if I just paste this pose, you'll notice that this changes. It kind of has a little more gravity. You see if I play this again now, the arms feel a little bit heavier and they just kind of have a little bouncy overlap. But one thing you'll notice is they're further away from the rig controls, whereas the other one, this guy, let me do this, has the hands much closer. So physics is still enabled, but it's not quite the same. So I get kind of a different feel. So another setting I did in the library, oops, do this again. Pull the arms up like over his head. So if I do something like this, the only other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the hands and pull vectors into world space. That way when I move the body, they stay put. So right now I still have the same physics settings that I did, which is kind of upper body and arms. But in this case, let me hop out of the camera. What if I wanted it to feel like he's dangling and hanging from something? So I could use this pose that I made and paste that. And now you'll see it put him into this kind of hanging state, right? So now I can, he collides with the ground. I have stretch on the arms. And I get all this kind of stuff for free, which is kind of cool. So if I delete that animation and I just record my mouse a little bit doing this kind of thing, I get all that stuff for free, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, that was just a quick version showing the pose library. More to come.
So I'd like to thank Fred for showing us that, which is just one aspect of how control rig physics fits in with the other systems in Unreal Engine. But next, let's talk about using control rig physics for gameplay and cinematics in the Witcher 4 Unreal Engine 5 tech demo. So hopefully everybody has seen this. It was shown at Unreal Fest earlier in the year. And we chose to concentrate on using control rig physics on the horse, Kelpie, using it both for cinematics and gameplay. We had it running on the mane and the tail, responding to the horse movement and the wind as it gallops. All the saddlebags and so on are simulated. The stirrups were simulated, but then they fit to her feet and turn to being animated as Siri mounts the horse. The reins were simulated, both when loose, and then when Siri mounts, as she holds them in one hand, and then she holds them in two hands, and then in a moment, as she rides away, then she moves her hands towards the horse's mouth as well, and the hands move along the reins. So here's a closer look at Kelpie, which is where all the control rig physics was used. And you can see the physics is running here. And we had 3 control rigs with physics. So all of them actually started out relatively simple. And then over time, of course, they became a bit more complex and interesting. So we had one running on the mane and the tail. We had another on the objects dangling off the saddle. And then a third one running on the reins. And these were running underneath the new Unreal animation framework system. So this meant that the cost was entirely on the worker threads. So that includes all the simulation cost and all the control logic that I'm going to show you in a moment. So let's look first at the objects dangling from the saddle and the straps. So we got some gameplay. It's captured in slow motion. It's in this shading style because it's a little bit easier to see the objects on the saddle. And you can see we got secondary physics on the rope and the bags and the cup and even the little saddle straps right at the back of the horse. And actually, all these things moving around, they really enhance the sense of realism. So let's have a look at how we simulated those using control rig. So in fact, we already had a physics asset for the objects dangling from the saddle and straps. Because actually, if you need accurate shapes, it's better to set them up in the physics asset editor. So we'd like to be able to use this asset with control rig. So it's actually very simple. This is the control rig construction. We import the skeleton, and here we create a physics solver component. We tell it to put the solver underneath the root bone. And then after that, we call this function instantiate from physics asset. We use default settings. We just give it the name of the physics asset. And then after that, in the forward solve, we step physics. And the only thing we need to do there is to tell it where to find the solver component on the left-hand side. So as soon as we do that, it's done. Right, now we have all the physics running in control rig on the left-hand side. In the end, of course, we complicated things by putting in support for switching the stirrups between animation and simulation. But actually, it was really nice to be able to start with this super simple setup and then extend it exactly as needed. So actually, if you simply want to use a physics asset, you only need 3 control rig nodes with very little setup. You add the solver, you instantiate from physics asset, and you step the solver. Now, admittedly, you could do the same thing with a rigid body animation node in animation blueprints. You get pretty much exactly the same simulation behavior. And it's arguably slightly easier because you've just got one node. But actually, as soon as you want to extend or customize the setup, then control rig really comes into its own. And of course, you can still use control rig in animation blueprints. Okay, so let's look at a slightly more complex case. So here, now look at the mane and the tail. So they clearly respond to the movement of the horse, as well as the background wind in the game. And again, the main physics setup was actually authored in a physics asset. But there were 2 additional things we needed to do. So the first is we needed the mane to collide with the rider's body. So you can see it resting against her legs sometimes, and sometimes it goes behind her legs, and sometimes in front of her legs, but it never goes through her legs. And this, when you think about it, was a little bit tricky because the mane and the tail are part of the horse, so there's no reason to think that this control rig would know anything about the rider. However, control rig lets us add bones dynamically. So we were able to add extra bones to represent the parts of the rider we are interested in. So this is part of the horse's mane and tail control rig construction. So we have this import collision from physics asset node, and that's going to bring in collision shapes from the rider's physics asset. And they're going to appear as physics bodies and bones in the horse's hierarchy. And since they're in the hierarchy, they're going to get added to the simulation. Then during the forward solve, their transforms are updated based on the rider animation, and so we get the desired collision. And you can see them. You can see them here. Hopefully, the little blue circles and capsules just above the horse's body. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. So let's look at the tail. So the tail is actually quite interesting because it's an expressive part of the horse. So we want to be able to combine animation and physics. So here's the horse again, but actually physics is now disabled on the mane and the tail. So you can see the underlying animation. We have these little tail flicks during the idle animation. And when you canter, we actually had animations there too. But we didn't actually have any animations on the tail during the gallop. And also, as you transition from movement to idle and vice versa, you don't kind of get the swinging and so on. So let's do the real thing. We're going to add parent-space controls, because they're going to act like muscles. But the result isn't great. So the tail sort of hangs down vertically. It doesn't follow the shape that the animators asked for, even when there's no movement. Those flicks were just like twitches. And as we ride around, the tail kind of looks like a rope hanging off the back of the horse. It's not kind of light and fluffy. And it swings out wildly and all sorts. So, excuse me. Of course, we could make the controls stronger, but actually it turns out that if they're strong enough to look good when idle, then when you're galloping around, the tail looks really stiff and unrealistic. So it's like animation and physics weren't really working well together when we were using parent-space controls on the tail in this situation. So we took a different approach. So first of all, we assume that the animator has already accounted for gravity, so we simply turn that off on the tail. And instead, we use a combination of linear and angular simulation space controls to pull the tail gently towards the animated pose. So the strength here is kind of either 0.5 or 2, so say 1. It kind of matches the way that the tail would naturally sway around about once per second. And the damping is 0, so the movement is going to be soft and springy. And so we start treating the tail more like a puppet. So we assume that the animator has created the core movement, and we just want to layer physics on top of that without actually replacing it. So now we have these puppet-like controls. This is the behavior. So the tail is actually going to match the target pose exactly when there's no movement. It kind of does a reasonable job on the tail flick during idle. It's not quite as nice as I'd like. But when you're cantering around and galloping around, I think it looks kind of quite loose and fluffy. It does swing out, sure, but it stays under control. So this was the setup we used in game. Okay, so now let's look at the reins. So the reins push the system beyond what we really anticipated. They let us do things that would have been really hard without control rig physics. And they needed to be simulated so they'd adapt to the locomotion. And we also didn't have the animations to make them match the rider's hands. But as I said before, when Siri mounts the horse, she picks the reins up, and then she drops them. Sometimes she holds the reins in one hand, and sometimes two. Sometimes she moves forwards along the reins towards the horse's mouth. So in construction, we didn't use a physics asset for the reins. We just made them procedurally by looping over the bones. Super simple. But we did use an asset for the horse's head and neck collision. So we can instantiate from physics asset here and just import the bones we're interested in. And then we added logic to the control rig to hold the reins. So we have a couple of controls to represent where the reins should be held on the left and the right. Each one of those had a mode which says whether or not the reins should be free or locked to the saddle or held. So on the left, it's now being set to held. And we can move the whole position along on both hands independently. And you can see the reins tracking along, adjusting to the hand position. So control rig is measuring the distance from the hold point to the horse's mouth. It multiplies it by a parameter which specifies how slack the rein should be, say like 1.2 or so. Then it calculates the rein body and the position on the body that's exactly that distance along the reins. And then it enables and adjusts the control to hold the rein at that point. And that's how Siri is able to hold the reins and slide her hands along them, whilst giving us control about how much slack there should be in those reins. Okay, so I'm not going to claim that writing that control rig graph was simple, but I thought it was really fun. But in spite of all that, we can expose just what the game needs in the animation graph. So this is just cut and paste from the graph in the Unreal animation framework. We've got a really simple control rig node with a handful of meaningful inputs. So we just pass in where the two hands are, whether or not each hand should be holding the reins. So we've got an example of a control rig. It's got lots of internal complexity, but it's simple to use. So here it is running. So we can grab the reins and release them. Here we've set it up so the reins are really tight. So she's going to ride the horse. It's a bit like a sort of racing jockey with very tight reins. Or we can adjust this slack value and now make the reins very loose. And now when she gallops, the reins are so loose, it just looks like Kelpie is in charge. So we could tune this value until we got the look that we wanted. OK, so I'm going to move on to a few little tips. So the first tip is about when you're creating your physics rig. So I like to think of it as creating a physics rig as if you're making a puppet. So first you make some lifeless ragdoll using physics bodies and joints, and only then do you add your physics controls to bring it to life. And as well as that, remember that the parent space controls, which behave like muscles, they won't always be the best way to control your puppet. So parent space controls are great when you want to see emergent physics movement, which is still influenced by the target animation. But if you want to layer physics on top of animation with more art-directed movement, then the best results often come from using these simulation space controls. So, for example, if you've got a tail, do you really need to use gravity to make it swing? Or could you use simulation space controls that have got just the right amount of springiness, but also track the motion better? Or if you've got a character hanging from a ledge, it's the same. So there's no gravity here on the character on the left. Instead, there are soft, springy simulation space controls so that he swings while still tracking the animation target on the right. Or if you've got a character jumping through the air, you can use angular simulation space controls to animate its pose, whilst letting physics take care of its trajectory through the air. Another thing is to mention that one of the hardest things about working with physics is trying to figure out what on earth is going on. So in the step physics solver node, there's a bunch of visualization options, which can be really, really helpful. And in addition, if you're running in Pi during game, there are a bunch of CVARs, so you can enable this visualization, and these can really help. There are a few things to watch out for too. So first thing is that physics introduces a lot of state into control rig. So for example, all sorts of crazy things can happen if you've got a level sequence and you start jumping around the timeline. So you might want to do things like have at the beginning, you can just make the character entirely kinematic, and then at least you can kind of rescue things by jumping back to the first frame. Another thing is that at the moment, control rig can be influenced by the environment, but not the other way around. So here, the ball is going to push the mech, but the mech can't push the ball, and we're working on that. But the biggest thing to remember is it's experimental, so think twice before using it in production, as things are likely to get refined. But yeah, in the meantime, do try it out and let us know what you think and have fun with it. And we're going to be working on adding support for the global solver, so then we can have two-way interactions with the environment. And also improving things like the tooling and integration with the rest of the engine. And that brings us to the end. Actually, there probably is. I don't know if there's time for questions. So maybe time for a few questions. But I'm going to be around afterwards as well if you want to come and have a chat. So in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention. And I hope the mech and I... Yeah. Thank you.